The whispers of liberation promise a distant shore, yet the anchors hold fast, unseen, within the very fabric of our yearning. You seek freedom, perhaps, from the burden of the past, from the phantom grip of expectation, from the ceaseless chatter of the mind. But what if the seeking itself is the subtle chain? Watts knew this paradox. The more fervently you grasp for enlightenment, the more it eludes you, a butterfly always just beyond reach because your hand is already closed. Consider the currents of your being, the relentless push and pull of desire and aversion. Each conscious effort to free yourself implies a self to be freed and a state to be attained, a duality that perpetuates the very illusion of bondage. The striving for tomorrow's peace diminishes the quietude of this breath. The rejection of what is strengthens its hold. Are you truly confined by external forces, or by the inner cartographer mapping territories of imagined lack? The cage is not built of bars, but of the very blueprint you carry within, a persistent narrative of not yet. To what extent have you internalized the notion that freedom is a destination rather than the intrinsic nature of the journey itself? This persistent whisper of, "Why haven't you freed yourself yet?" is not a judgment from without, but an echo of the question you carry within, a question that, in its very asking, binds you to the quest. The labyrinth of self-improvement promises an exit, a sudden breach into pure being, yet often it deepens the maze. You've devoured texts, mediated on mountains, whispered affirmations into the void. Each discipline, each practice, initially feels like a key, but soon it transforms into another lock, another ritual binding you to the idea of an unfree self needing mending. Watts understood the insidious nature of this quest. The pursuit of authenticity can become the most elaborate form of self-deception, a sophisticated avoidance of what simply is. Consider the subtle violence of judgment you inflict upon your own unfolding. Every moment spent analyzing your spiritual progress, every comparison to an idealized state, subtly reinforces the notion that you are fundamentally flawed, incomplete, and therefore unfree. This internal critic, masquerading as a guide, is the very sculptor of your perceived limitations. It convinces you that there's a problem to be solved, a gap to be bridged, a self to be perfected, when perhaps the only problem is the belief in the problem itself. The "haven't freed yourself yet" isn't a deficiency. It's the engine of a relentless search, a search that, by its very nature, presupposes something is lost. What if the chains are woven from the persistent belief in their existence, and the constant effort to shake them off only tightens their invisible grip? The quest for authenticity often culminates in an uncanny performance of the self. You strive to be real, to shed the layers of societal conditioning, yet this very striving creates a new layer, the diligent performer of realness. Watts insightfully pointed out that the effort to be natural is the most artificial of all acts. This paradoxical pursuit traps you in a recursive loop, where the more you try to strip away the inauthentic, the more entangled you become in the definition of what authenticity should be. Consider the energy expended in presenting a purified, liberated version of yourself to the world, or even to your own internal observer. This constant self-monitoring, this meticulous editing of thoughts and feelings, becomes a subtle form of bondage. It's a self-imposed censorship, born from the fear that your true, unvarnished self is somehow inadequate or unacceptable. The question, "Why haven't you freed yourself yet?" then morphs into a quiet accusation. You're not trying hard enough. You're not enlightened enough. This internal dialogue, far from liberating, reinforces the very ego it purports to dismantle. It binds you to a future ideal, stealing the vibrancy from the present moment, where true liberation might quietly reside, unnoticed in the frantic search. The very pursuit of control, whether over one's emotions, circumstances, or even the trajectory of one's spiritual growth, often becomes the most intricate of prisons. You meticulously plot courses to inner peace, devise strategies for emotional detachment, and strive to master the untamed currents of existence. Yet Watts revealed the futility in this. The attempt to impose order on the inherently fluid nature of life is to fight against the current, exhausting yourself in a struggle that promises only more resistance. Consider the tension in your shoulders, the subtle clench in your jaw, born from the persistent belief that you should be able to manage every ripple on the surface of your being. This self-imposed pressure, this yearning for a perfectly curated inner landscape, creates the very friction it seeks to eliminate. The question, "Why haven't you freed yourself yet?" echoes not from a lack of effort, but from the misdirection of that effort. It implies a struggle against an enemy that exists only in the mind's rigid definitions of how things ought to be. True liberation, Watts suggested, lies not in gaining control, but in surrendering the illusion of it, in allowing the river to flow without attempting to direct its course. The constant negotiation with discomfort, the desperate avoidance of what is deemed negative, forms a subtle yet potent shackle. You might meticulously curate your experiences, seeking only joy, serenity, or positive affirmation, pushing away the shadows of sadness, anger, or existential dread. Watts observed that this very act of division, of labeling parts of existence as undesirable, perpetuates suffering. The attempt to transcend pain by ignoring it only grants it deeper roots. Consider the energy you expend in resisting what simply is. Every flinch away from an uncomfortable emotion, every distraction employed to escape a difficult truth, builds a wall, not around the discomfort itself, but around your own capacity for wholeness. The question, why haven't you freed yourself yet, then becomes a judgment on your perceived inability to maintain a constant state of bliss. But what if freedom lies not in the absence of pain, but in the radical acceptance of its presence, in allowing the full spectrum of human experience to flow through you without resistance or judgment? The real prison might be the one you build with your own hands, brick by brick, from the fear of feeling. The relentless pursuit of certainty, of definitive answers to life's profound ambiguities, is a subtle yet powerful cage. You crave a clear map, a fixed destination, a guaranteed path to liberation, believing that knowledge will dispel all shadows. Yet, Watts eloquently showed that this very need for absolute understanding often blinds you to the vibrant, chaotic beauty of the unknown. The insistence on knowing how to be free becomes another form of intellectual bondage. Consider the anxiety that arises when faced with life's inherent unpredictability, the quiet panic when the old frameworks crumble. This discomfort, this yearning for a solid ground beneath your feet, propels you into a ceaseless search for doctrines, gurus, or rigid philosophies that promise to explain everything. But what if the very act of grasping for ultimate truths prevents you from simply experiencing the fluid, ever-changing reality of the present moment? The question, why haven't you freed yourself yet, then echoes with the frustration of an incomplete puzzle, rather than the acceptance of a mystery. True freedom perhaps lies not in knowing all the answers, but in the profound courage to dwell comfortably within the question itself, to dance with the uncertainty without needing to resolve it. The illusion of separation, the deep-seated belief that you are distinct from the world, from others, and even from your own experiences, is a profound delimiter of freedom. You carve out an I that observes, that judges, that acts upon a separate it. Watts, in his profound simplicity, dissolved this boundary, illustrating that the self and the universe are not distinct entities, but inseparable aspects of the same flowing process. Your persistent feeling of aloneness or otherness is not a fundamental truth but a deeply ingrained habit of perception. Consider the anxiety that arises from feeling isolated, the perpetual striving to connect, to belong, to bridge a chasm that might not truly exist. This yearning for reunion, born from the premise of separation, fuels much of your perceived lack of liberation. The question, why haven't you freed yourself yet, then resonates with the ache of a self-longing to escape its own perceived confines, unaware that the very idea of a confined self is the core of the illusion. What if freedom is not about breaking free from something, but realizing you were never truly separate in the first place, that the dance of existence is one seamless, interconnected flow, and your individuality is merely a unique expression of the whole? The weight of expectation, both self-imposed and subtly absorbed from the collective, is a constant, invisible burden. You carry the unspoken decree that you should be happier, more accomplished, more at peace, or somehow better than you are. Watts often dissected this societal pressure, revealing how the idealized image of a freed individual creates a new form of internal tyranny. You are not striving for liberation, but for conformity to an imagined perfection. Consider the quiet exhaustion born from this relentless internal comparison. Every perceived deviation from this ideal becomes a source of self-reproach, a confirmation that you haven't freed yourself yet. This internal monitor, constantly assessing your spiritual GPA, is a deeply ingrained habit, passed down through generations of striving. But what if freedom lies not in meeting an external standard, but in the radical acceptance of your own unfolding, flaws and all? The true shackles might be forged from the very desire to fit into a preconceived notion of what liberation looks like, rather than simply inhabiting the messy, vibrant reality of who you already are. The subtle tyranny of language, the very words you use to define your reality, can be a potent, invisible barrier to freedom. You categorize, you label, you narrate your experience into neat conceptual boxes, believing that by naming something, you understand it, and thus control it. Watts often highlighted how this intellectual framework, while useful for communication, can obscure the living, flowing, ineffable nature of existence. Your persistent mental chatter, the internal monologue that dissects and analyzes, can become a self-imposed prison of definitions. Consider how often you feel confined by the labels you've accepted for yourself: anxious, unmotivated, unfree. These are not inherent truths, but linguistic constructs that shape your perception and limit your potential. The question, why haven't you freed yourself yet, is itself a linguistic trap, implying a discrete state of being that can be attained, rather than a continuous unfolding. What if true liberation lies not in finding the right words to describe freedom, but in transcending the need for words altogether, in stepping beyond the conceptual framework and simply experiencing the raw, unfiltered reality of the present moment? The most profound freedom might be found in the silence between words, in the space where definition dissolves. The relentless search for meaning, for a grand purpose or a definitive understanding of your existence, can itself be a profound impediment to freedom. You meticulously construct narratives, seek external validations, and chase after experiences that promise to fill an imagined void. Watts often challenged this very premise, suggesting that meaning isn't something to be found out there, but rather something that arises from the spontaneous, undirected dance of being. The incessant questioning of "why am I here?" can overshadow the simple truth of "I am here." Consider the quiet despair that settles when the constructed meaning crumbles, when the grand narrative proves insufficient. This frantic grasping for purpose, this belief that life requires an external justification, creates a subtle tension, a feeling of inadequacy in the face of the universe's indifference. The question, "why haven't you freed yourself yet?" then morphs into an existential lament, a desperate plea for a cosmic roadmap. But what if freedom lies not in discovering a preordained purpose, but in the radical acceptance of life's inherent meaninglessness, or rather, its meaning as the spontaneous, playful unfolding of existence? To release the burden of needing to find meaning is to discover that meaning is simply here, in the breath, in the light, in the unspoken connection to everything. The persistent identification with your thoughts, the belief that you are your mind's ceaseless commentary, forms an unbreakable bond. You mistake the swirling currents of consciousness for the riverbed itself, allowing every fleeting judgment, every anxious projection, every nostalgic echo to define your very being. Watts frequently illuminated this fundamental error. The self you perceive, the I that worries about not being free, is largely a construct of thought, a conceptual entity rather than an intrinsic reality. Consider the overwhelming noise within, the endless loop of analysis, planning, and self-critique. This internal monologue, while seemingly an instrument of your will, often becomes its master, dictating your moods and limiting your perception. The question, "why haven't you freed yourself yet?" is often spoken by this very internal voice, perpetuating the illusion that there's a problem to be solved by more thinking. But what if freedom lies not in silencing the mind, but in realizing you are not the mind's incessant clamor? What if you are the vast, silent space in which these thoughts arise and dissolve, like clouds passing through an empty sky? To disidentify from the mental stream is to step outside the prison built brick by conceptual brick. The subtle allure of spiritual materialism, the tendency to accumulate practices, insights, and experiences as if they were possessions, subtly obstructs genuine liberation. You might meticulously collect techniques for mindfulness, dissect ancient philosophies, or boast of profound meditative states, believing that these acquisitions will lead you closer to enlightenment. Watts frequently warned against this trap. The spiritual path, when treated as a quest for external achievements, becomes another form of consumerism, merely perpetuating the ego it seeks to transcend. Consider the quiet satisfaction you might derive from identifying as spiritual or awake, the subtle pride in having done the work. This very identification, this attachment to a refined self-image, becomes a new layer of illusion. The question, "why haven't you freed yourself yet?" then shifts from a genuine inquiry to a self-flagellating critique of your spiritual progress. But what if freedom is not about accumulating more, but about releasing the need for anything extra? What if it's found in the simple, unadorned state of being, stripped of all spiritual adornments and pretensions? The truest liberation might arise when you cease performing spirituality and simply are. The insistent habit of waiting, of perpetually postponing your true engagement with life until some future condition is met, is a fundamental impediment to freedom. You tell yourself that peace will arrive when the bills are paid, when the relationship stabilizes, when the perfect opportunity materializes. Watts often exposed this self-deception. The future is a conceptual space, a mental construct that allows you to evade the vivid, unadulterated reality of the present. By delaying your full participation, you bind yourself to a perpetual state of anticipation. Consider the countless moments that slip through your fingers, unlived, because your consciousness is tethered to a conditional then. This constant deferral of happiness, of stillness, of simply being, creates a subtle but pervasive anxiety. The question, why haven't you freed yourself yet, then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as true liberation is perpetually relegated to a horizon that recedes as you approach it. What if freedom is not a state to be achieved in the future, but a radical embrace of the messy, imperfect unfolding now? To truly step into liberation is to cease waiting for life to begin, and to recognize that it is already, undeniably, here. The subtle addiction to suffering, the subconscious comfort found in familiar patterns of struggle and dissatisfaction, can be an astonishingly strong impediment to freedom. You may consciously yearn for release, yet find yourself repeatedly drawn back to narratives of hardship, self-pity, or conflict. Watts recognized this deep-seated human tendency. The known pain, however debilitating, can feel safer than the vast, uncharted territory of genuine peace. Consider the identity you've perhaps unconsciously built around your struggles, the stories you tell about your burdens and limitations. This narrative, while seemingly confining, can also offer a strange sense of purpose, or even a perverse kind of distinction. The question, why haven't you freed yourself yet, then becomes a lament, not an impetus for change, precisely because the perceived lack of freedom serves a hidden psychological function. What if true liberation demands the courage to relinquish even the most deeply ingrained forms of suffering, to step out of the dramatic narrative and into the quiet, unscripted reality of being? The heaviest chains might be those woven from the threads of your own familiar sorrows, the subtle resistance to simply being, to letting go of the relentless need to do or to become, is a profound, yet overlooked barrier to freedom. You are conditioned to believe that worth is derived from action, from constant striving, from the ceaseless pursuit of goals. Watts frequently emphasized the liberating power of stillness, of allowing the universe to express itself through you, rather than attempting to force its direction. This ingrained compulsion for activity, for constant production, often obscures the inherent perfection of the present moment. Consider the discomfort that arises in moments of true idleness, the urge to fill every silence, to plan every next step. This aversion to simply existing, without agenda or outcome, creates an internal churn that prevents genuine peace. The question, why haven't you freed yourself yet, then becomes a judgment on your perceived lack of spiritual productivity, a subtle demand for constant progress. But what if freedom is found not in more doing, but in the profound acceptance of not doing, in the radical embrace of simply being? The deepest liberation might reside in the courage to let go of the oars and allow the current to carry you. The illusion of scarcity, the deeply ingrained belief that there isn't enough time, enough love, enough resources, or even enough enlightenment, is a pervasive cage. You operate from a framework of lack, perpetually striving to accumulate, to secure, to hoard, believing that true freedom can only exist in a state of abundance. Watts frequently challenged this capitalist-infused spiritual narrative, revealing how the universe, in its very nature, is an unfolding expression of infinite possibility, not a limited resource to be grasped. Consider the anxiety that permeates your days, the constant worry about future deficiencies, the fear that you will miss out or fall short. This scarcity mindset, far from motivating liberation, binds you to a relentless cycle of striving and dissatisfaction. The question, why haven't you freed yourself yet, then becomes a subtle self-reproach, implying that you haven't acquired enough spiritual capital. But what if freedom lies not in the accumulation of more, but in the profound realization of inherent abundance? What if liberation is found in trusting the spontaneous generosity of existence, in understanding that you are already complete, and that the universe is perpetually providing even in its apparent emptiness? The subtle allure of comparison, the persistent habit of measuring your own journey against the perceived progress of others, is an insidious constraint on freedom. You scrutinize the apparent serenity of a guru, the visible achievements of a peer, or the idealized peace depicted in spiritual texts, believing that your own lack of these external markers signifies a profound deficit. Watts eloquently unmasked this social delusion. Each individual's unfolding is unique, and to superimpose another's path upon your own is to deny your inherent singularity. Consider the quiet erosion of self-acceptance that occurs with every internal benchmark against an external ideal. This relentless social calculus, far from inspiring liberation, fosters a sense of inadequacy, a persistent whisper that you haven't freed yourself yet because you don't look or feel like someone else's definition of freedom. But what if true liberation lies not in conforming to a universal standard, but in the radical acceptance of your own particular, unfolding present? To truly be free is to cease the agonizing comparison, to recognize that your own rhythm, your own breath, is the only measure that matters. The profound resistance to nothingness, the innate human discomfort with emptiness, with silence, with the void that underlies all form, is perhaps the ultimate invisible barrier. You meticulously fill every moment, every space, every internal quietude with sound, with thought, with activity, fearing that in the absence of something, there will be nothing. Watts, with his profound understanding of Eastern philosophies, invited a radical re-evaluation of this fear, suggesting that the void is not an absence but the fertile ground from which all existence springs. Consider the panic that can arise when confronted with true stillness, the urge to grasp for a new thought, a new sensation, a new distraction. This deep-seated aversion to the formless, to the unmanifest, keeps you perpetually tethered to the world of phenomena, to the illusion of solid separate things. The question, why haven't you freed yourself yet, then echoes from a fear of dissolving, of losing the familiar contours of the self. But what if freedom is not about gaining something, but about courageously embracing the emptiness, the vast, boundless space that is your true nature? To step into liberation is to realize that the nothing you fear is precisely the everything you seek.